Hello everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our CERIS community panel discussion today. We have an exciting panel for you. I would just like to start off with some preliminary issues, starting off with a land acknowledgement. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Métis, and Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. And we cannot begin a discussion of immigration without reflecting on the harm that colonization has done with our First Nations, and hope for an immigration strategy that will lead to reconciliation and justice. And without further ado, I'd like to start with our first presentation by Adnan. Actually, I should introduce all the speakers first. So the speakers will be in order today. Adnan Türegün from CERIS, Léonie Tchatat from La Passerelle, Sunil Johal from the Mowat Center, and Debbie Douglas from OCASI. My name is Bill Sinclair. I'm the moderator for today from St. Stephen's Community House. We'll start off with Adnan and his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. First, I would like to say two things about the title page, if it's on the screen. First, I think the title I put is a bit ambitious. I hope we do justice to the title. But that's our goal anyways. The second thing I would like to mention is the acknowledgement of the contributions of my research colleagues at the University of Toronto, Ryerson University, and York University. The names are all there, and I appreciate their contributions. It's a collective work. Next, please. Introduction. This afternoon, I'll be sharing some of the most important findings and recommendations of a national research and service review that we conducted at CERIS as part of a larger project on immigrant women, youth, and seniors. We call it IWIS for short. Although the scope of the review was national, many of the findings and recommendations are relevant to Ontario and, of course, other provinces. And also, I should also mention the focus of my presentation. I won't be entering into immigration, broader immigration issues. Mostly my presentation will be on settlement service gaps and how we fill them. Next, please. Our review of the national research literature and service landscape has identified three major gaps for immigrants in Canada, service gaps, I should say. And there are many other gaps, but these are, to me, are the most important ones. First, stringent eligibility rules for federally funded services exclude large sections of the immigrant population. Two categories that I would like to highlight for that section of the population. One is the recent citizens who are former permanent residents. The second group is so-called temporary migrants who are potentially future permanent residents. So these are the two main groups that are excluded from federally funded settlement services. Services funded by the provinces, municipalities, and non-governmental organizations have more flexible eligibility rules, but they are far from filling this service gap across the national geography. So in this context, it's imperative that Ontario's newcomer settlement program continue to cover newcomer populations that are not covered by the National Settlement Program. So this is an issue I would like to discuss with you later if you have time. Second, the second service gap is rooted in the Eurocentric social gospel tradition. Canadian settlement services have long been infantilizing immigrants and refugees. And they have yet to acknowledge the diversity of the newcomer population on many dimensions, including racial, ethnic, linguistic, religious, and cultural dimensions. It's time to recognize that immigrants are adult, resilient people who have overcome many difficulties of life and who have preferences and ideas for themselves. We need to acknowledge this. I don't know how service sector, service provider sector does this. Of course, there is acknowledgement, but this is an overall gap in the sector. We need to identify that, recognize that. Third, although research in general highlights the importance of family as a unit of analysis for settlement outcomes, and although there is a greater recognition of family in service conception and programming at the policy level, settlement services are still very much organized on the premise of individual outcomes and outputs and outcomes. So this is the third largest gap that our research synthesis reports have identified. Next, please. And aside from these three outstanding gaps, there are also gaps specific to our three immigrant groups, women, youth, and seniors. And I would like to highlight only three of them as gaps, and they relate to content and accessibility of services. First, for women and seniors, language training services are particularly hard to access for reasons of family responsibility, childcare, pressure to work, and lack of transportation. Second, the absence of older adults and seniors in immigrant-specific employment services is a glaring gap, considering the fact that they do not have government support either, income support either. In our survey of the national service landscape, we haven't come across any significant employment-related program for seniors. Well, this is partly because of the life cycle understanding, because seniors are by definition are out of the employment cycle, but there is also, it's also a political choice. So this is a second important gap that we have identified in relation to seniors in particular. A third gap, for youth dealing with instability at home, research highlights the need for immigrant family inclusive educational and health services that address their special circumstances. I hope there is a representative from the youth team here who can speak to this gap more if we have time. So these are the three main gaps that I wanted to highlight. There are, of course, more specific gaps in relation to immigrant, women, youth, and seniors, and we don't have time to go through them, but they are in the slides and they will be put on the CERIS website, as well as the full reports that are available on the CERIS website. So these IWIS specific gaps relate to content, accessibility, and eligibility of services. So if Rana, you can move to slide 10. Now, of course, when we identify and highlight the service gaps as such, the next logical step would be recommendations. So we have a number of policy recommendations that are based on our knowledge synthesis research. These are policy recommendations, but they also intersect with service. So I would like to mention 4 of the recommendations concerning policy. First, build into policy a holistic understanding of immigration and settlement that takes families rather than individuals as the unit of analysis and practice. We keep preaching this rule, but there is still recognition that is needed. Ontario has recognized this to a certain extent in its 2012 immigration strategy document by putting helping newcomers and their families achieve success as a policy strategy goal. Second recommendation is create a pathway to permanent residence and citizenship for all classes of temporary migrants, a pathway. Third, relax eligibility requirements for federally funded settlement services to allow temporary migrants and recent citizens access. I should mention that there is already a widespread recognition for enlarging the eligibility rule to at least to cover certain sections of the temporary migrant population. One population is refugee claimants. Another population would be recent citizens who just became citizens, but they still have integration and settlement problems. A fourth recommendation, again, this intersects with the service as well, relax the 10-year residency requirement for immigrant seniors to be eligible for old age security. And we have service recommendations. I know we don't have much time, but I would like to go over them quickly. Likewise, we adopt a family-centered approach when conceiving, designing, and delivering settlement services. Second, pilot employment and self-employment programs for immigrant seniors, and expand existing ones, especially those with occupation-specific job placements for immigrant women and youth. Third, make language training more accessible and rewarding for immigrant women and seniors by expanding on-site childcare, providing transportation subsidies, reaching out to rural communities, organizing flexible class schedules and locations, experimenting with new methods of delivery, and customizing content to diverse needs. Fourth, next slide, please. In addition to in-school settlement workers, employ cultural brokers to mediate between newcomer students, families, institutions of different cultural backgrounds, and facilitate service provision in a school setting. Fifth, approach and deliver health and mental health services in a gender, race, and culture-sensitive framework. And sixth, expand community-based activities to reduce social isolation among and increase social support for all 3 groups of migrants. In conclusion, last slide, please. As you recognize, some of the gaps and recommendations we highlight concerned areas of federal jurisdiction. However, the provinces, including Ontario, have a large room for maneuver in such key settlement areas as education, language training, employment, health, and housing. And as such, they also have a large responsibility for the settlement and integration of immigrants. Thank you.
Good morning, bonjour. As you all know, Canadian is a bilingual country, so I will speak in French. Mais mon aceta will be in English so you can follow. c'était un grand plaisir pour moi d'être ici ce matin et de pouvoir partager le point de vue francophone dans le cadre de l'immigration francophone et dans un contexte de stratégie ontarienne en matière d'immigration. Ce matin, j'aimerais partager avec vous des données probantes sur lesquelles la Passerelle, l'organisme que je représente, nous avions présenté, développé des approches basées sur des statistiques réelles. Et mes propos vont se concentrer sur vraiment les avantages économiques que les immigrants francophones apportent et contribuent dans notre prospérité canadienne ou prospérité ontarienne. Je n'aimerais pas beaucoup m'attarder sur l'aspect culturel, humain, parce que de toutes les façons, les immigrants arrivent dans le contexte de favoriser la construction plus ample et plus profonde de l'Ontario de demain. Merci. À stade 2. La Passerelle que je représente est un organisme à but non lucratif créé il y a 20 ans. Nous travaillons beaucoup dans l'intégration et le développement économique des jeunes francophones arrivant de toute origine. 80% de nos participants, de nos programmes et services sont offerts aux immigrants. 15% de nos clients sont nés des parents immigrants et 92% appartiennent à des communautés racialisées. Et donc, vous imaginez l'ampleur de l'enjeu. Ah, c'est à croix, si je peux. Je m'excuse, je dois tourner en même temps mes feuilles. Dans l'esprit de la stratégie ontarienne et en matière de l'immigration, le gouvernement de l'Ontario s'est engagé envers les communautés francophones de façon claire. Et dans le cadre de cette stratégie, explicitement reconnu les communautés francophones comme des communautés d'accueil, aussi des récipiendaires des bienfaits de l'immigration, à ce même titre que d'autres communautés en Ontario. Et notamment dans la stratégie du gouvernement de l'Ontario, l'objectif et la cible est d'atteindre les 5% de l'immigration francophone qui couvre le total de la province. Ah, c'est à 4. Donc, il est important de comprendre que l'immigration francophone apporte des bienfaits à l'ensemble de la province et non seulement à la communauté francophone ontarienne. Le gouvernement est un nombre croissant d'acteurs économiques l'ont compris, dont le secteur privé, comme le gouvernement, ont compris que les immigrants francophones sont une valeur ajoutée pour l'économie de l'Ontario. Si on prend par exemple le marché francophone au Canada, est fort de à peu près 8 millions de personnes, donc c'est un potentiel économique. Cela aussi comporte des potentiels d'affaires non négligeables pour les entreprises ontariennes de tout horizon. C'est à 5. C'est 5 ? Ouais. L'étude du centre MOAT, Diaspora and Nation, a établi un lien significatif entre les diasporas disponibles localement et le commerce international. En effet, les immigrants eux-mêmes apportent dans leur contribution la langue, des compétences culturelles, de l'expérience, les reconnaissances et les connexions vers d'autres pays. Donc, si un employeur embauche un immigrant francophone, c'est un potentiel sur l'ouverture dans le monde, c'est aussi des potentielles opportunités économiques. La francophonie internationale est responsable à peu près de 20% des échanges commerciaux dans le monde, ce qui est très important. Et là, on va voir que l'Afrique, y compris l'Afrique francophone, est le continent au plus haut taux de croissance économique. Everybody is talking about the potential of Africa now as human capital. So, c'est assez important. C'est à 6. Je m'adresse aujourd'hui à vous aussi en tant que co-présidente du Francophone Workforce Development Council, un des deux modèles prouvés et développés par la passerelle dont j'aimerais vous partager avec vous aujourd'hui. Ce conseil de talents bilingues qui est représenté public, privé et communautaire a vu le jour en 2015. Et le mandat est de favoriser le développement et la canalisation des talents francophones vers les acteurs, le secteur clé de l'économie. Mais c'est aussi sur des énergies entre gouvernement, employeurs et institutions de formation postsecondaire et organismes communautaires de développement du capital humain. Il est composé des représentants des ministères, des institutions collégiales, de la ville de Toronto, des employeurs et certainement des employeurs œuvrant dans différents secteurs, transport, communication, hôtellerie et technologie. L'approche de ce conseil est axée sur les talents francophones chez les employeurs impliqués dans le secteur. Les consultations et les recherches que nous avions faites ont naturellement identifié les secteurs nécessaires et la demande en fonction des employeurs sur lesquels les talents bilingues francophones doivent se canaliser. Je dois remercier ici tous les bailleurs de fonds comme Trillium Fondation, le ministère des collèges et universités et d'autres ministères fédéraux qui contribuent beaucoup à faciliter la mise en œuvre de ce conseil et puis la stratégie de la passerelle. Le modèle comporte une implication substantielle des employeurs et des consultations, ce qui est très, très important pour nous. C'est A7, c'est bon? D'autres approches, modèles éprouvés, c'est le forum sur le capital humain. And I need to take this time to maybe say thank you again to Alice Hyun, who's there, because we will never say, everywhere I will see you, Alice, I will remember and mention you. Because as a non-profit organization, we sit down in our office thinking about ways to find solutions for this talent. But we need champions like Alice from the other side of the government to believe in what the vision and to create that opportunity. And so the first forum that we launched in 2013 was because of Alice, and thank you, and because you believe that the Francophone community has a strong potential. Thank you very much. Donc le forum, justement, nous permet de chaque année de faire valoir les institutions qui vont discuter sur les questions stratégiques des talents bilingues et discuter sur des modèles vraiment appropriés pour répondre aux besoins de ces talents. On me dit que j'ai 10 minutes. Donc, je vais passer à la CETA 8. Si vous regardez le tableau, vous allez voir où sont les secteurs de demande en emploi en Ontario. Vous allez voir que la région d'Ottawa, quand on fait des postes de demande d'emploi, les francophones, des annonces en français, 20% de ces annonces comportent la maîtrise du français. Et c'est beaucoup juste dans la région d'Ottawa. Et dans la région de Toronto, on a à peu près un pourcentage de 7%. Dans les deux cas, il s'agit d'un pourcentage supérieur à la proportion des francophones sur l'ensemble de la population et la province, et qui est environ de 4%. En outre, on sait aussi que ces annonces incluent les primes salariales de 20%, ce qui indique l'importance accordée aux employeurs pour la langue française. So, employers are telling us that they can find francophone bilingual talent, but they are there, and we can see where les postes qui sont annoncés. À stade 9, voilà. On sait aussi, dans le tableau qui suit, que les emplois de certains secteurs économiques ont un plus haut taux de croissance dans certains secteurs. Il y a un plus grand nombre de pourcentages pour les postes disponibles en français, pour les talents francophones. On compte parmi ces secteurs le secteur de la santé et services sociaux, le secteur des finances et assurances, les technologies de l'information. Et nous remercions vraiment la firme Mercer qui nous a aidés à développer toutes ces recherches-là pour nous permettre à la passerelle de développer des programmes sur mesure. Je vais rapidement passer à travers les autres slides qui montrent des résultats sur des recherches primaires. Nous remercions encore le gouvernement de l'Ontario et la Fondation Metcalf pour leur soutien à la réalisation de ces recherches-là. Par exemple, vous voyez que les compétences techniques sont assez importantes et les compétences personnelles sont recherchées actuellement par les employeurs dans le secteur de la télécommunication. On voit aussi qu'il y a beaucoup de programmes de formation qui sont peaufinés en fonction de cette réalité-là. So when you look at where job posting or requirement for French are looking at, and the employer are requiring a lot of interpersonal skill in order for Francophone talent to access to this kind of job. ACETA 11. Dans le secteur de la télécommunication, vous voyez un peu les demandes en termes de les technical skills et puis les interpersonal skills recherchés par les employeurs dans ce domaine-là. Et c'est tout ça qui nous permet vraiment de développer des programmes sur mesure pour pouvoir, j'ai 5 minutes, pour pouvoir offrir des formations assez adéquates. Donc, je vais passer plusieurs secteurs. On va aller à la CETA 14. Toujours là, on regarde toujours tout ce qui est demandé comme French skill, les postes au niveau des transports aériens, de via rail ou des transports sur terre, comme des autobus. On voit très bien les postes où les bilingues francophones doivent appliquer. Maintenant, la diapositive 15 parle aussi de tout ce qui est en termes du savoir pour les talents bilingues francophones. Qu'est-ce que les employeurs recherchent comme soft skills, work requirements et connaissances. Ces approches ont vraiment permis aux employeurs de s'impliquer dans le cadre du workforce et du conseil que nous développons pour pouvoir finalement nous donner à la passerelle une approche beaucoup plus stratégique dans le but de développer des programmes qui vont répondre aux besoins des employeurs, mais aussi aux besoins des talents bilingues. C'est clair pour nous que notre approche est vraiment basée sur des approches stratégiques qui ont été prouvées. Et tu as la CETA 16, voilà, qui ont été prouvées. Et j'aimerais encore souligner que dans sa lettre d'esprit, le gouvernement de l'Ontario a démontré réellement qu'il était prêt à investir pour les communautés francophones. Et nous avions à l'heure actuelle organisé 3 forums. Et on voit que ces investissements payent parce qu'il y a quand même un bon pourcentage des francophones qui trouvent l'emploi dans ce contexte-là. J'aimerais passer la CETA, passons à la CETA 17. 17, ouf. En finissant, récemment, lors du dernier forum que nous avions organisé, Madame la ministre Mulroney a dit cette situation. Elle a dit qu'en somme, l'Ontario désormais compte sur des modèles prouvés de collaboration et d'implication proactive multisectorielle pour l'optimisation et la contribution des immigrants francophones dans leur prospérité en Ontario. Et c'est à l'Ontario de nos contributions collectives à l'avenir de l'immigration francophone. Et donc, c'est très important de voir que même le gouvernement s'engage et reconnaît qu'on a besoin de données probantes pour continuer à développer des programmes stratégiques. Et puis, on a aussi mis lors du forum, si tu veux avancer à la prochaine slide, la mise sur pied d'un conseil des talents bilingues. Tu peux passer, vas-y. Vas-y, continue. Voilà, la mise sur pied d'un conseil des talents bilingues pour nous aider dans les prochaines stratégies de la passerelle. Et pour continuer à faire le travail que nous sommes en train de faire, nous avions aussi envoyé à CERIS les 2 recherches que nous avions publiées. Et je crois que vous allez avoir, ils sont en anglais ces recherches, vous pourrez avoir accès à ces recherches. Ouf, merci.
Good afternoon. How is everybody doing today? So I have a very simple thesis that I'll be exploring in the next 10 minutes, and that is that Canada's economic future hinges upon our success in getting immigration policy and immigration settlement correct. So I want to talk a little bit, before I get into the immigration side of things, the broader economic picture in Canada and across advanced economies. A lot of countries are talking right now about this notion of inclusive growth. How do we generate economic prosperity that works for everybody? So not just the top 1%, the top 10% of society, but everyone, because we're seeing record high levels of income inequality across advanced economies. We're seeing wage stagnation. We're seeing all these indicators that suggest that the economic growth models that we've been pursuing for the past 30 or 40 years are generating very uneven opportunities. So why are we talking about this? As I mentioned, I mean, it's the income inequality issue. It's the fact that digital technologies are threatening to exacerbate those inequalities. So when you look at a company like an Amazon or a Google or an Apple, I mean, these are trillion-dollar companies, but they're not really putting that wealth and that opportunity back into communities at a local level. I mean, we're kind of seeing that play out in real time in New York, where they, quote unquote, won the Amazon HQ2 second headquarters, and now all of a sudden local opposition to them coming has led to Amazon actually pulling out of New York as a second headquarters. So here are some of the statistics I'm talking about in terms of general economic trends. So you can see income inequality, top 1% of Canadians accounted for 37% of overall pre-tax income growth between 1975 and 2007. Precarious work, roughly 1 in 3 Ontarians are engaged in what we call precarious work, so they're part-time, temporary, self-employed with no employees. Wage stagnation, over the past 20 years, if you were engaged in work and you weren't a professional or a management worker, you've seen 0 wage growth in that 20-year period when adjusted for inflation. And obviously your housing costs, your childcare costs, your energy costs have all gone up significantly in that time. So here's just one graph to give you a sense of that disparity in income growth in Canada and Ontario. It's a little hard to read, so just a very quick explanation. So this shows you the percentage change between 1975-78 and 2010-12. So a 30-year period according to different income deciles. So the far left are the bottom 10% of income earners in Canada and Ontario, far right, top 10% of income earners. So you can see the bottom 10, 20, 30% of income earners are actually losing ground over a 30-year period. It's the top 10, 20% who are gaining and gaining significantly enough that when you average all of this out, it looks like, oh look, Canada's been growing at a steady, good pace over that 30-year period. And that's true at an average level, at an aggregate level, but when you peel beneath the numbers, there's obviously some troubling indicators there that the folks kind of in the bottom 30 or 40% of the income distribution are falling further and further behind. And then we layer onto this that digital issue. So are the robots coming to take our jobs? Will lots of jobs be automated going forward? Nobody really knows the answer to those questions, but I mean, there's certainly a strong argument to be made that technologies like Uber, for example, are taking what were decent paying, relatively permanent jobs and turning them into gigs that don't pay well, don't have any benefits, and have no real long-term security. So what's at stake? Economic anxiety about the future of work is certainly an issue for many people, thinking that they or their family may lose their jobs as a result of these technological changes. When we look at things like, well, why did Donald Trump get elected? Why is Brexit happening? A lot of that potentially could be traced back to this underlying economic anxiety where people feel they're working harder than ever, but they're not getting further ahead. So what's at stake here? We can't assume, essentially, that the drivers of economic growth over the past 30 to 40 years will actually still hold over the next 20, 30, 40 years. So what do I mean by that? So number one, we have significant demographic headwinds in Canada. You probably all know we have an aging population. By 2040, 1/4 of Ontarians will be 65 years of age or older, compared to about 16% today. So that invariably means fewer people in the labor market, more people who are going to be pulling on public pensions, more people are going to be potentially incurring significant costs from the healthcare system, and fewer people of working age to support them through the tax system. I'll talk about female labor force participation in a second. The commodity boom, if you've talked to anybody in Alberta lately, it's gone. Will it come back again? We don't know, but since 2000, that was a huge driver of economic growth in Canada, was the oil and gas boom in Alberta, Newfoundland, and other provinces. So if that's not coming back, where's our economic opportunity going to come from? And then you layer onto that the uncertain trade environment that we're facing. I mean, we've negotiated lots of trade agreements in the past 30 years. There aren't that many untapped opportunities going forward. So again, where's that new growth going to come from? And I mentioned female labor force participation. So you can see from 1976 to 2016, and this is women aged 25 to 44 and men aged 25 to 44, women's labor force participation has gone from 50% up to 78%, almost on par with men. So if we look ahead for the next 20 years, we don't have another 30% of women who aren't working to plunk into the labor force. That growth factor is pretty much tapped out. So this is where I get to the argument that if all of these things are in question or aren't going to return, where's the growth going to come from? So what I would argue is that immigration is the answer to this. I mean, we know that higher rates of immigration could potentially drive economic growth. Reports from Canada's Economic Advisory Council, Conference Board of Canada suggest that immigration is responsible for about 1/3 of GDP growth in Canada. And if we boosted immigration rates by 100,000, we could see a significant uptick in GDP growth over the next 10 to 20 years. And then there's also the issue of integration. So not just how many people we have who are immigrating to Canada every year, but how well are we integrating them. One recent study suggests that there's $13 billion in lost wages being left on the table for immigrants who are not employed at the rate or at the level that they should be, or in the type of occupation that they should be. So these are, I'm going to show you just 2 or 3 quick charts. This is from a recent report we put out at MOET about 6 weeks ago by one of my colleagues. So it's called Different Ontario, and it dives into the issue of immigration. So if you go on our website, you can find it and read it. I'm just going to kind of highlight a couple of the quick findings. So I mentioned inclusive growth. I mean, there's the issue of how are we generating prosperity for everyone. There's also the issue of how are we generating prosperity for all parts of the province or all parts of the country. We already know that most immigrants tend to settle in large cities. So I mean, these are the stats just here in Ontario. You can see as a proportion of the total population, immigrants are 46% of the population of Toronto. But as you go down in size to smaller and smaller municipalities in rural areas, under 25,000 communities, only 9.2% of the population in those communities are immigrants. So the question isn't just how do we get people into Ontario, into Canada, it's how do we make sure they're also generating opportunity in parts of the country that aren't Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, etc. This is a kind of a similar notion, but how many of the people in each of those different kind of size categories of geographic area are recent immigrants? And you'll see recent immigrants kind of maps onto how many are similar to the kind of proportion of overall immigrants. Far more recent immigrants stay in larger communities. And then this one's probably the most important one that was in the report, and this gives you a sense of what's the employment income of immigrants as a percentage of non-immigrants tracked over time. And you can see, so dating back to folks who arrived before 1981, and this is looking at it at today's level. So they today, in some cases, are making 130% of non-immigrant, their non-immigrant peers. And that's if they're 25 to 44 today. So the reason that's important is all of those folks arrived when they were children. So when you arrive in Canada as a child, it's much more likely that your income levels are going to be at or above your non-immigrant peers. But when you're arriving as an adult, the numbers are far more challenging. That's where you do see significant kind of fall off in a widening of the gap between your employment income and your non-immigrant peers' employment income. And those numbers are worse for women, and they're also worse for people in the skilled trades and certain other occupations. So things to keep in mind. So in terms of just wrapping up kind of broader policy questions, things we can hopefully get into in the discussion. So number one, how can we make more communities more attractive to immigrants? I mean, obviously job opportunities are one driver of that, but how can we focus on other maybe non-economic imperatives to get folks settling in smaller communities outside of Toronto? Second, how can we accelerate labor market integration? So looking at things like soft skills training, TRIAC does a great job on mentorships, so that's kind of one opportunity to look at further. Reform of foreign credential recognition, so reducing those artificial barriers to who can or can't be a doctor, a nurse, engineer in the province of Ontario. So I think that's all I wanted to touch on, and then happy to talk about some of these things more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am going to give you a break from multitasking of reading things on screens while trying to listen at the same time, now that you've heard from all of my colleagues who like to use that, what do you call that you just did? PowerPoint. Ignore my bio in your package. It's an old bio as I was reading it. I am not complicit in the education changes being made by this government. That was an expert panel from years ago under the previous Liberal government, where we actually did some good work in terms of implementing some equity policies. So that's my disclaimer. I want to begin by acknowledging the privilege of gathering here with you and speaking on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas, a territory that is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. In November 2018, the London and Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership launched I Am London, an online campaign to highlight the stories of refugees and immigrants. When you visit the I Am London website, you will meet Afiz Ajibowi, who came here from Nigeria with his family, complete with a master's degree in science from the United Kingdom, a career background in sales in the private sector, and is now working in project management at a local school board. You will meet Fan Lu, who came as an international student to study business and ended up changing her focus to psychology and volunteering at various local organizations. She's now working at the John Howard Society to help build bridges between newcomers and service providers in London. This is Ontario's immigration story. It is a story of people who came here to make a new life, who are doing well economically, relatively speaking, and who are making important contributions to their community and the economy. It is the story Ontario and Canada would like the world to know, the story of immigration. The kind of story that gives many of us inspiration, hope, and a sense of purpose to build strong and welcoming communities. The kind of story that reminds us of what Canada is all about, who we are as a people, and what we want to be in the future. And we also have the story that we also know that Canada's story of immigration is also a story of colonization. The immigration project has always been about settler colonialism and enriching the empire. Note that neither the federal nor provincial immigration laws make any reference to First Peoples, let alone our treaty obligations to First Peoples. And let me pause here to acknowledge, and I always have to do this as a woman of African descent, so let me pause here to problematize that not all of us here can be defined as settlers. We have a different historical and contemporary relationship, and when I say we, I'm talking about my people, my ancestors, those of us who are of African descent. We have a very different historical and contemporary relationship to Indigenous peoples in the Americas. My ancestors who were enslaved and brought here to labor throughout these lands were not complicit in the colonial project, but we do have a responsibility and a role to play in upholding the rights and standing in solidarity with Indigenous peoples here in Ontario and across Canada. Ontario's immigration strategy, released in April 2017 under the previous government, but which can still be found on the provincial website as of earlier this week, and I say this because every time I go to look for something, it's gone. It has a preamble that reads, "A new direction for immigration in Ontario, attracting highly skilled workers and their families, supporting diverse communities, and growing a globally connected economy." The Ontario Immigration Act of 2015 recognizes the role immigrants play in growing the economy, as well as the importance of family and humanitarian commitments, an acknowledgement that Ocasio insisted had to be present in the legislation. And Léonie was also part of that expert working group that developed the report that led to our legislation. But the Act very clearly lays out Ontario's main priority, which is the selection of immigrants for economic priorities to address labor market needs in collaboration with municipalities and employers. So what are the expectations of stakeholders? Ontario continues to be the biggest player and biggest beneficiary in Canada's immigration project. By the end of 2018, Ontario had welcomed 137,000 people who arrived as permanent residents, with the majority being people in the skilled workers stream. It was an increase of over 25,000 over the previous year. And we should note that there has been a steady increase since 2015, a long-awaited reversal of a trend that saw our numbers decrease throughout the previous decade. In fact, during the decade prior, under the previous government, the previous federal government, Ontario's permanent resident numbers went into a steady decline from about over 125,000 in 2006 down to 95,000 in 2014, while Canada's overall immigration numbers either went up or remained more or less the same. Ontario was losing a share of immigration to other parts of the country, primarily Alberta and BC. And I won't go into all of the shenanigans of the former Conservative government that caused quite a decrease in our numbers. So the Express Entry Program actually is helping Ontario's numbers. We now have a provincial government that has not put out an immigration policy or even a position, although we can probably infer a lot from the statement that our current Premier made during the provincial election campaign last year, that Ontario should take care of its own first. And the fact that the province with the largest share of immigration does not have a dedicated minister or ministry for immigration and refugee settlement, integration, and inclusion. This is telling. But Ontario will continue to benefit from immigration. In fact, many communities, especially in Northern Ontario and other rural areas, and Sunil's graph was telling in terms of we see how little immigrants are going to areas outside of the major cities. But Northern Ontario and other rural areas in the province had made it very clear that they are counting on immigration to not only succeed economically, but need it for their very survival, given the demographic challenges many are facing. In fact, it's stakeholder role, and so whether or not the province acknowledges it, it is an important stakeholder in immigration. In fact, its stakeholder role, and these are smaller and rural communities, is described in legislation, public policy, and intergovernment agreements like the Canada-Ontario Immigration Agreement and the Canada-Ontario-Toronto Memorandum of Understanding. I was in Sudbury yesterday, and many of you may have heard about the federal government's new pilot project for rural and Northern Ontario, where they will identify 2,750, I believe, seats, and small centers are invited to put in application. I think the deadline is coming up sometime in the next week, and it was really interesting to be part of the conversation that's happening in the North in terms of how is it that we can attract and retain immigrants. I think for the first time around the table, you have mayors, you have economic councils, you have faith communities, you have service organizations, and you have regular folks all coming together to talk about how important immigration is and what it is that they need to put in place to attract and retain. One note of concern, however, was that rumor has it that the federal government is actually trying to reduce the numbers that was announced to 1,100 as opposed to the 2,700, which we didn't think was enough in the first place. I'm going to take that extra 3 minutes that Léonie didn't use. Anyways, so in looking for, that was just an aside, in looking ahead to the future, Ontario must also find a way to work with the many stakeholders that have an active interest in immigration, including immigrants and migrants themselves, refugees, including refugee claimants, OCASI and the immigrant serving sector here in Ontario, the private sector, industry groups, business associations, and employer associations, municipalities, the education system, especially school boards and public and private universities. I think for the first time we're seeing that we have more international students here in Ontario than we have permanent residents and or migrant workers, which in itself is a significant change in terms of numbers. So, for example, we have 264,000 international student permit holders currently in Canada, and that is compared to the total number of people who came as permanent residents, which was about 137,000. And so we will see that Ontario actually received almost twice as many international students than we did permanent residents. There is something there in terms of how we tap into international students as our source for immigration to Canada. So really needing to look at our point system and how and the kind of policy changes that need to be made so that we're not only looking at postgraduates transitioning to permanent status, but we're also looking at undergraduates who may want to stay in Canada. But what does this all mean for us as we look ahead to Ontario's immigration future? Given immigration selection criteria, only a small number of the more than 250,000 international students who arrived in 2018 will qualify to stay as permanent residents, if that's what they want to do. Meanwhile, they will be living and studying here and working. They don't qualify for federally funded settlement services. And I realized that when Adnan was speaking, he identified the various groups that's left out of the federally funded. And you didn't mention international students, so I wasn't sure if that was a political decision that you made, that international students should not be included in federally funded services. Certainly a point of contention within the sector and across the country. So many folks are now saying that the universities and colleges who are benefiting from international students' fees should be contracting with settlement workers themselves and using that money to deliver services. I think it's a discussion that we can continue to have. I think there's some merit to that. I'll skip over some of this stuff. We heard from Sunil about women and earning less than men, but I wanted us to talk about, and Sunil didn't talk about it, that while women, and in particular immigrant women, earn less than men, and I think we're looking at women in Ontario earn 29% less than men, that number jumps to 43% when we look at Indigenous women, 38% when we look at women of color, and 34% when we look at immigrant women. Consider the fact that international work experience is a plus point for Canadian-born workers, but it is the opposite for immigrants and refugees, not to mention the impact of all the other factors of race, ethnicity, and faith. Looking ahead, how do we ensure that Ontario's prosperity is not built on the exploitation of refugees, immigrants, and migrants? Granted that Ontario's prosperity is not equitably shared, but that is a conversation for another way. What is our responsibility to ensure that Ontario's immigration adventure does not further perpetuate settler colonialism? What is our responsibility as a sector, specifically the immigrant and refugee serving sector, that the government refers to as the settlement sector, to hold our governments accountable to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and the call to justice for missing and murdered Indigenous sisters, and much more. And I promise I will end in exactly 1 minute. As we look ahead to Ontario's immigration future, I don't want to downplay the serious challenges ahead. We have a provincial government that has talked a lot about putting the province's fiscal house in order and is hell-bent on finding efficiencies. That has cut some provincial services and has either announced or hinted at cutting other services. This is despite the fact that Ontario's per capita spending on programs is the lowest of all provinces, according to a report last month from the Financial Accountability Officer. We don't know if the province will maintain services for people with precarious immigration status, including refugee claimants. We don't know what's ahead for Ontario's poverty reduction strategy, one where we fought to have the disproportionate disadvantage of people of color, as well as refugees and immigrants, recognized. We don't know what's ahead for Ontario's Anti-Racism Directorate, which was tasked with the responsibility for implementing disaggregated data collection across all of government, which is a significant policy lever to recognize and then move to address disproportionate disadvantage on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, immigration status, as well as many other factors like disability. We are looking ahead to a federal election in the fall this year, and the outcome will have a significant implications for Ontario's future with respect to immigration. At the same time, we are seeing more actors speaking up not only about the economic benefits of immigration, but also the need to ensure that immigrants and refugees can thrive economically as well as culturally and socially. We have tremendous responsibilities ahead of us. In practical initiatives that support credential recognition, supporting immigrants and refugees to find good jobs or to start business, support civic engagement and cultural production. We are seeing a growing interest from a broad range of actors in wanting to change the narrative on refugees and on immigration through traditional media and social media, and it's a campaign that Ocasio and our colleagues here in Ontario are working on with United Way of Greater Toronto, especially given the negative narrative around refugee and refugee claimants and asylum seekers. We are seeing more and more Ocasio member agencies connecting with local Indigenous organizations to build awareness, understanding, and better relations. And finally, it is very much falls on all of us to be present and engaged in the immigration discourse with all sectors and stakeholders to keep pushing for the kind of province we want to see, where all residents are counted and where all residents can participate. Thank you. Thank you for your patience, Amina.
We just heard in a rapid fire presentation some discussion around the future for immigration in Ontario, the future for families and for the diverse immigration status of the people that are here, the future for our economy and immigration's role in the economy, the future of the Francophone community and the opportunities in our community, and the story of immigration in Canada, including future challenges and opportunities and the role that the settlement sector can play. We have 45 minutes for discussion, for question and answer, which I will try to help moderate. One of my roles, because we are recording this for the CERIS website and people can join us at a later date and join the learnings, is that when people ask a question, I will repeat it so that it can be recorded. If people have questions for specific panelists, please do feel free to identify the panelists you're directing your questions to. I think we'll start. At some point, I think the panelists may have questions for each other, but let's start with our audience. Would anyone have a question for our panel? Yes.
I'm an immigrant to this land, and I have taken to heart the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action 93 and 94, which speaks directly to newcomers. I'm also a disability justice activist, and I believe that to make anything accessible, we have to start from the moment of design. So I'm very encouraged to see that you all have very comprehensive suggestions for policies. I would like to know how far back are both accessibility implementation as part of the policies you are offering, and also are we actually working together on the same line with educating newcomers about our duties on the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action?
Thank you for the question, especially the question around accessibility. One of, I think, an ongoing advocacy priority for us is really dealing with the issue of inadmissibility due to disability and health in the immigration in IRPA. We have seen some movement. For example, I think we've been successful, and it'll be interesting to see if it's consistent in terms of people who are deaf or hard of hearing being inadmissible for sponsorship. We saw this came up with caregivers in particular who, as they were getting ready to sponsor their children who presented with disabilities, there was often a pushback, and in fact were turned down working together with the settlement sector and the disability communities across Canada, we were able to have that overturned. Now, what we don't know if this is going to be done on a case-by-case basis, and then every time someone gets turned down, they have enough information to be able to reach out, and then we have to keep going back again. But I do think that we have a federal election coming up. As OCASI, we will continue to raise this. We've raised it over and over again with the Minister of Immigration in terms of having a change made, and I don't know if they're immigration lawyers, but I'm not sure if it can be done through a regulatory change or if it has to be a reopening of OPA and its legislative change. But either way, we need to remove disability as a medical inadmissibility to Canada. We are on the relationship question with Indigenous peoples. I think I am hopeful. Increasingly, I'm hearing from our sector that they're wanting to make that link. As a council, we have committed to building strong relationships with Indigenous communities across Ontario. My board and staff have been doing an annual gathering and training with Indigenous peoples. We've included Indigenous organizations in the trainings that we're doing on governance, for example, especially some of the grassroots Indigenous organizations here. Taking off my sector hat and my work at OCASI, as an African Canadian woman, I am very heartened to see the way that Indigenous people have stood in solidarity around issues of anti-Black racism, and the way the Black community continues to stand in solidarity, and the way Black Lives Matter and Island No More have found common ground and work together.
Any of our other panelists like to weigh in? Okay. Another question?
Hello, everyone in this room. I'm happy to be here. Thanks to the panel member for their insightfulness and changes that has to be made or to come. I'm always wondering in the back of my mind if we should also, when we're throwing out what needs to be done, like on a now basis, I'm wondering if we should also address the fears around how we build policy around, let's say we're talking about immigration, now to write that discourse, we're talking about those other people, what those other people are bringing or not bringing to the table. So I'm wondering if we should address fears, if I'm making that clear enough. What are the fears that we harbor as a society, and how we can shed ourselves from these fears that we hold as an ideology.
Some of the fears that Canadian society holds
Yes.
around the immigration question.
Yes.
And I think that was alluded to in a couple of the presentations. Sunil, would you like to go first?
Quick couple thoughts on that. I mean, we're seeing that play out in real time in the US right now at a very high level. I mean, I think in Canada, some of the rhetoric is pointing in that direction in advance of the federal election. So I do think it's important to kind of put that out on the table and have people have open conversations about, guess what, immigrants aren't other people, immigrants are you and your neighbor and your family members. And I mean, I think you kind of see in the research that when people are presented with real stories about real people, they have no issues whatsoever with that person. It's at the very high level of, oh, do you support letting more immigrants into the country, that people start getting worried and saying, well, I don't know, that might be a risk. But when it's, oh, your neighbor who moved here 12 years ago and now does this, oh, I have no problem with John or Bob, he's great. So I think we need to kind of personalize these stories and let people know that, I mean, we are a country of immigrants. Immigrants are all around us, and that's what has made us a great country. And I think that would kind of take some of the poison out of the high-level rhetoric around hundreds of thousands of immigrants or refugees flowing over the Quebec border, which gets people worried because it's kind of this unknown other. But those same others were the Tamil refugees or the Vietnamese boat people 3 decades ago, and they're kind of very well integrated in Canadian society today.
I will try to speak in English, and if I can, I have a translator there to help me. I think you raise a very deep and important question. In the Francophone community, as you know, we come in from a different perspective of, of the policy of challenge. Being Francophone and Black and woman is more challenging for me than my white Francophone, white Francophone woman. So we, La Passerelle, the organization I work with, we launched 2 campaigns. The first campaign was to sensitize the welcoming Francophone community in order that they can see the add value that immigrant was bringing in the community. That immigrants are not just here, Francophone immigrants are not just here to take away your job or to take away, but in fact to add more in terms of culture, economic, and so on to this new to the society. And the second campaign was around employers to really show to employers that when you hire a Francophone immigrant bilingual talent, you are opening your door to many opportunities, and you also bring new way of thinking in your institution. So, but when you're looking at in the context of systemic racism, now you're talking about another subject, and recently, and just this morning, I was talking to international immigration officers who are here and promoting Francophone immigration. I recently hired a 2 people. One was coming from France and the second one was coming from Africa. And I have sent in the application from the potential candidate in Africa 3 months before I applied for the potential candidate in France. The one who in France got the visa, but the one in Africa did not. So these are really issues. And this is a question that we need to bring on the table and to understanding that the perception that Africa have around immigration and that the agent, people who are working overseas and thinking that all Africans are just doing fraud, they are not correct and so on. This is wrong, completely wrong. And this is really affecting the policy and the immigration. Canada is about inclusion, value, and so on. And why is that a specific country will have this negative, profile than the other? The question at the end is that: do we want a Canada should promote for white immigration, or should be just open to any potential immigrant that are coming and live in this society?
Here, here.
Sorry, I tried to.
Here, here.
Okay. That's good for the panel? Okay.
Debbie, you want? No?
I think it's been said.
It's been said. Okay. Another question for the floor.
Hi, thank you to all of you. My question relates to the federal exclusion of immigrants in a lot of programs. I run federally funded programs at Georgetown College and am painfully aware of the impact of people who cannot access those services. I also know that the federal government just conducted an extensive series of consultations across the country. I wasn't part of those, but I cannot believe that this issue did not come up. And I'd be very interested to know from people, I'm certain there are people in the room who were there, how the feds responded to that.
The question was
Service eligibility.
the service eligibility for the IRCC. There was a consultation, and was that raised, and what was the response?
I am closer to the mic, so I can start.
Okay.
About the exclusion of certain categories of migrant populations from federally funded services, let me just put a corrector for Debbie. Debbie, the international students are in the slides, but they are under the potential future permanent residents. So because of lack of time, I didn't name all of the temporary migrant populations. I simply highlighted the refugee claimants. Are we good?
Yeah.
About the exclusion, coming back to the exclusion, we are in the primary stage of this research on immigrant women, youth, and services, and we are talking to service providers, policymakers, researchers about services in Ontario in particular. The fact that it hasn't come up as an issue in the consultation process, it's news to me. But I can say
it came up all the time.
It came up all the time.
all the time. I'm sorry. To me, I think there is a greater understanding, recognition of the need to make certain, at least part of the temporary migrant population eligible for federally funded services. I highlighted the especially two populations in my short presentation. Refugee claimants, that would be one category I think any sensible policymaker would recognize as a legitimate population. And also for recent citizens who just became citizens, there is a greater recognition that especially women, in the case of women who are recent citizens, that they need to have access to language training simply because they didn't have time or resources to attend language classes when they were permanent residents. But I should just conclude with this with a general statement that even among policy circles, I don't want to give any specifics, but even in policy circles, there is a hopeful sign of recognition of the need for eligibility of this category of populations.
Oh, do you want to say
Passing the mic.
Can you?
I'll let you go first.
Eligibility of services through federally funded programs is a key issue for us. It comes up every time we were at the table at the federal government. About 3 or 4 years ago, we thought we had a good opening, especially around migrant workers, and then the Royal Bank story hit the media, and that went right off the table. There is a pilot project at a BC funded by what's ESDC? Employment and Skills Development or Social Development Canada. That's funded a small pilot around providing services to migrant workers. Whether or not that will be scaled out across the country, I don't know. We're certainly pushing on it. But for us, the group who are most vulnerable and who were really wanting to have access to services are refugee claimants. We felt that we had an opportunity with the new Caregivers Pilot that was recently announced, that 3 months for folks who have been here for at least a year, who came post 2014 and are able to put in an application for permanent resident status. It's a very easy, relatively speaking, process, and we thought, oh, okay, it's an election year. This government seems to be in a good mood. Let's push around eligibility for services. Well, yesterday we got the answer, absolutely not. Organizations are not allowed to, even if we know that if not all, at least 98% of those women who are putting in those applications will become permanent residents in the next 6 to 8 months. So it is the key issue in terms, it makes no sense that at a time when with some populations their acceptance rates is 70-80%, that they're not able to access services until after they receive PR, even after being in the country for 4, 5, 6 years. It makes absolutely no sense.
Just one quick comment. This is kind of a challenge with many government programs where governments, especially in an age of fiscal austerity such as we are experiencing now, are making short-term decisions that have very significant long-term consequences. And minimal or kind of moderate investments in the short term would actually pay off much more significantly in the long term if they were made. But that's just not how government planning horizons and fiscal decisions are made. So I think we kind of almost need to take a step back, because it's not just on immigration and settlement programs, but you look at the program like employment insurance, where half the number of unemployed Canadians are eligible for EI now as compared to the early 1990s. Who does that benefit? If we have somebody who's out of work, not eligible for EI, what's going to happen to that person? They're going to probably start drawing down social assistance, selling off their assets, and they're kind of spiraling into a much worse situation than if we broaden the eligibility for the program and help people. So I think we need to rethink how we make these decisions and we need to reward governments and think of some way the system can reward governments for making investments in the short term that might seem like they're costing us something, but then 5 years down the road, they're actually paying off and they're smart decisions. And that's a tricky nut to crack.
Yeah.
I appreciate what all of you have said, but nobody has actually answered how the federal government has responded to this in these consultations. Is it all about finances?
No, in the consultations, they took information in, but they did not challenge or they did not feel that they had.
Yeah, the federal government is used to us raising this issue. They know that it's an issue. They're hiding behind Treasury Board regulations, right? And our pushback around that is that the department decides what its criteria is, gives it to Treasury Board, and then Treasury Board holds them accountable to what it is that they've decided the scope of their program is. So it's a political decision that has to be made. We need the minister, and the minister uses finance as the issue. That if we were to open up eligibility, I think last week I heard him say we'll have to double the $700 and whatever million we spend on settlement outside of Quebec. Well, you know, Quebec gets almost $1 billion and takes in 40,000 people. Maybe we should use some of that money.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the great presentations and insight. I hope we can access them as well. It would be great. My question is thinking about the economic growth and the importance of economic integration for immigrants, and since Canada is the land of immigrants and so on and so forth. I felt that there is some sort of a gap between policies and the reality of the job market, especially for skilled workers who have international competencies and experiences. It is when policies and the country itself talks about diversity and inclusion and economic integration and all that, but in reality when skilled workers approach the job market, the first obstacle that they face is the lack of Canadian experience, and somehow they struggle to just integrate in the system. And this is something that I personally, I'm an immigrant myself, and also other skilled workers, qualified friends, they somehow face the same issue and obstacle. So I'm just wondering if when policies are drafted, does it include, is it an exercise that includes job providers, the corporate world, for example? Yeah, so that's my question.
So
Thank
the question
you.
is, when policies are developed, are employers and labor market experts involved, and the continuing challenge of skilled immigrants. Mm-hmm. And I think that was touched on by all four panelists. Who would like to
We're looking
try?
at Sunil.
Debbie's just trying to push me into the deep end where I don't know anything about an issue. So I think I've been there for an hour and a half now. So, but I mean, yeah, absolutely. Policies can be government legislation, regulations, but they also have to sift down to where people are being hired, and that is the private sector, the nonprofit sector. I mean, there's significant research, very interesting research, pointing out that depending on what your name is, your odds of being called back for an interview are drastically less if your name is from a certain, is kind of what would be historically viewed as from a certain country or from a certain background. And some companies, to their credit, are instituting policies around that. So putting in name-blind screening in the HR department. So you don't see the person's name, you just see what their qualifications are. And I mean, that's, but when we start talking about that, I mean, we're getting into very difficult areas of human kind of cognition, kind of unconscious bias issues that people have, and it requires training. I mean, large federal departments are doing it right now. They're training people in unconscious bias. So there may be things you're not even aware that you're biased about or biased against, and we're going to try and surface that in your mind so that when you make a decision or when you're developing a policy in government, you don't do that. So we need that kind of training in the private sector. as well. Because I mean, quite honestly, you're right. I mean, we talk a great game in Canada about how inclusive and diverse we are, but we still have huge issues around discrimination, racism, and I think that does disillusion a lot of people. I've got the same qualifications or better than the people who are getting the job. For some reason, I'm not even getting an interview. And I mean, I've seen it anecdotally, I've seen the research on this. It's something we need to do a hugely better job at, but I think to do a better job at it, part of that is acknowledging that we have a problem. And I think sometimes the rhetoric around how diverse and inclusive we are gets in the way of us recognizing there are actual real problems in terms of discrimination in the labor market, whether it's for immigrants or people from certain racialized communities or certain other categories. So I think there's a lot more to do there.
I also think that our policy folks don't speak to each other. So we have immigration policy that brings you in because you have these high skills and particular education. You get points for you to come to Canada, you work in a regulatory body, and then realize that the fact that Canada recognizes your skills has nothing to do with whether or not your regulatory body in Ontario will recognize those skills. I don't want to put Margaret on the spot, but I think, Margaret, that's a question you may want to comment on in terms of what are some responses in terms of our regulatory framework. I think it's about political will, right? I think it's about provincial governments saying to the regulatory bodies, here in Ontario we have a fairness commissioner without any teeth, and the little teeth that the office had got taken away and will probably even be taken away even more with this government in place. And Sunil talked about how much we lose in terms of dollars by underutilizing or underemploying immigrants that we bring in because they're not able to use their skills. But Margaret, you can certainly comment in terms of some of the work that's happening around the regulatory framework.
There's a mic behind you.
Hi, I'm Margaret Eaton with Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council. You know, certainly the recognition of foreign credentials is a huge issue. We've done recent research that shows that it is still an issue, and that one of the things that immigrants are doing is getting more Canadian education, just as a way of actually putting something on their resume that indicates that they can do a job in Canada because they got this other credential. But I'm disturbed that we have a fairness commissioner in Ontario and his contract expires on April 4th, and we do not know if it will be renewed. And so it will be very interesting in the next little while to see whether this government is actually going to continue to support that Fairness Commission. And while you may feel there's a little bit of controversy around what is the effectiveness of that commission, I believe the new commissioner actually was looking very deeply at the legislation and looking at what are the tools that they can use. And we're actually starting to implement a risk-based framework, which basically means instead of asking everybody in the regulated professions to tell them about their success, it was an audit-based approach. So they could actually go after those regulated professions that have proven to be recalcitrant and actually audit them, which I think would have been, I say would have, I hope that this will be the action that they're going to take, and I very much hope that they will be renewed, but that's a huge issue. And then the other piece is national harmonization. So we don't have the same standards in every province, and that's also another big barrier for immigrants trying to figure out which province should I land in, and why are the requirements different from, you know, New Brunswick to be an engineer versus an engineer in Manitoba. There's some really nutty things going on in our country around credentials that definitely need to be addressed.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question, and I think the panel revealed the difference between the criteria for coming to Canada and the disconnect with the criteria for actually getting the jobs. That there may not be that there's anyway, so.
Yeah.
I know this issue of foreign credential recognition and the requirement for Canadian experience. I just don't want to talk about it. We have been talking about it for the last 30 years, at least for the last 30 years that I have been in Canada. But I would like to pick up on Debbie's and Margaret's point about the disjoint, as Bill put it. Canada has I would say, the most decentralized federal system. It's mostly the federal government which decides on immigration, who gets in. but at least 80% of the labor force is regulated at the provincial level. There is this disjoint that is one of the main reasons for the problem that many skilled immigrants are having in Canada. An asymmetric federalism, a decentralized federalism. There are federalisms who are successfully implementing policies of integration. I would give the example of Australia. Well, at least in methodological terms, they are having a more concerted approach to the integration of skilled immigrants. But in Canada, this federal disjuncture, rather this federalism, decentralized federalism, is causing a lot of problems for skilled immigrants. And I don't know, short of a reconstituted federalism, there needs to be some action-oriented approach to this.
So the question was around any solutions or initiatives around barriers to the hiring process to begin with. I think Sadil referred to one of them related to how resumes are screened and things like that.
I can share what we are doing currently within the Francophone community and my organization. When you look at the statistic, we serve, like I said earlier, 80% of our clients are from the Francophone racialized community. This community are coming with knowledge, skill, and academic background. But when you look at the statistic, they are low in terms of getting access to job or retention to job. So after many years of struggling and looking different options of how are we going to approach this, because when you're looking at the system and the systemic barrier, it's a puzzle. It's hard to get in. One of the things that we decided to do in 2015 was to create the Workforce Francophone Council. With that Workforce Francophone Council, we brought in the government, the private sector, institution. And from there, we piloted the first pilot program was within the financial sector. But the change on that process was the fact that we have employers sitting on the table and guiding us with what they were looking for and what was the challenge. And we didn't want to just have any human resource from the financial sector. We wanted to have the VIP, like the vice president of, a specific talent acquisition. So the fact that they are sitting on the table and they are acknowledging the needs of bilingual, they are creating really that opportunities for this candidate. So the workforce with the relationship with this employer has changed everything because they are engaged. They're actually guiding us in terms of how the training should go, and they are opening the hiring process for this candidate. So that was one way. The other way was also to work in terms of the soft skill of our candidate and the knowledge, the soft skill and knowledge. As immigrant, when you come here, most of the time, if you were an engineer in your country and, they say, let's start maybe as a customer service, this is not something that you are very open to it. So we are working a lot in terms of informing and sensitizing our client to take the first door and first opportunity. We are also launching every month the breakfast conference where we bring in employers to meet potential candidates and to, after that, they have the first contact of job interview for at least the 10 minutes. And from the last 5 years, we have increased the number of potential candidates to access to job. So this is one way that we are using within my organization and it's working pretty well. Je vais répondre en français et en anglais. First of all, Francophone does not have any advantage. In fact, we are fighting to have that advantage. Okay? Les communautés francophones ont une position très spécifique dans le domaine de l'immigration. Si tu regardes les dernières années, on a créé une stratégie de l'immigration francophone en situation minoritaire. Justement parce que quand on regarde l'enveloppe de la stratégie globale de l'immigration, on se rend compte que 5% de l'atteinte des francophones, ce n'est rien, comparativement aux objectifs de l'immigration francophone dans sa politique globale. Et je pense qu'il est important de reconnaître que les francophones ont un statut assez spécifique et que dans ce statut-là, on doit créer justement des politiques et des approches spécifiquement à ces communautés-là. Quand on arrive comme francophone et qu'on ne parle pas l'anglais, on est complètement exclu du marché du travail. Donc c'est important et c'est pourquoi les programmes que nous développons, par exemple à la Passerelle, où on sensibilise les employeurs, où on parle du potentiel des immigrants francophones qui apportent des valeurs ajoutées à la prospérité et l'économie de l'Ontario. Donc en termes, et puis historiquement, peut-être tu dois le savoir, que les francophones se sont bagarrés pendant des années et des années pour essayer d'accroître leurs acquis, leurs atouts. Et nous, les immigrants, nous arrivons dans cette panoplie d'enjeux et ça devient très complexe. Donc, quand on arrive comme immigrant, la question aujourd'hui de se poser, c'est de savoir, est-ce que quand on arrive comme immigrant, on doit regarder le français comme une langue première ou on doit regarder le bilinguisme comme une opportunité? Parce qu'il y a des vrais défis. So, I don't know how I will encourage that, but that is more technical.
Do we think that anti-immigrant sentiments are a long-term issue that we'll need to address? And what are some of the ways that we should be addressing this?
I think it is certainly an issue now, especially, and I think Adnan and Bill talked about this, there is a real anti-refugee and anti-refugee claimant, but for the regular Canadian on the street, they could give a hell about, the difference between an immigrant, a refugee claimant. I think that at the time, it is critical for us to work, when I say us, I'm including government here, to work in counteracting some of those negative sentiments. The federal government has been proactive in terms of setting up its Immigration Matters campaign. There are a number of us here in Ontario beginning work, Okasi, with some of the refugee houses, the United Way, and one of the PR firms here are working on a campaign that we intend to roll out as part of our election strategy, targeting the folks who generally support immigration, as Sunil made reference to that, but have questions because of all the information that they're getting. And you're absolutely right, social media information is so instantaneous, and even false narratives get repeated over and over. So we need to put out information like our border, our sovereignty is not at stake. I was in Morocco with the Canadian delegation in December, and watching the news from Canada coming from our official opposition was just astounding, right? That somehow by Canada signing on to a global compact on migration, which is really a nice, feely document that doesn't bind any country to anything, and the Canadian government can just throw it out and nothing happens to it. But the rhetoric was that somehow Canada was signing away our sovereignty. So we've got to counter those with factual information. We've got to talk about the fact that people enter our country legally to seek asylum, that we have processes in place as soon as people cross over. Sunil is absolutely right. We have got to humanize refugee claimants. We've got to talk about, we have to remind people, including some who are in here, that many of our poor people came in as immigrants to Canada. And I think that we need to have this conversation everywhere. We need to have it in the grocery stores, we need to have it in our faith communities, we need to be having it in our classrooms, and we need to be having it in our service agencies, because I guess I'm not as surprised as I was when I first heard it, but many of those sentiments are also coming from frontline settlement practitioners who themselves believe the nonsense. And so we have lots of work to do, but we need to mount a concerted effort with key messages that we're all saying across the country.
And our last question.
Hi, my name is Courtney. I work specifically with LGBTQ newcomers who are youth, 29 and under, predominantly refugee claimants. I guess more of a statement and sort of a general question or thought. A lot of the youth that I'm working with are claimants, therefore cannot access or struggling to access employment training programs because they're not, or they are federally funded.
A lot of them are working unsafe cash jobs with no safety. Access to housing is a whole other conversation. And I'm just curious, so many of these folks are sort of tucked into the dark corners of Toronto, and there aren't a lot of services for them. And I'm just curious your thoughts, or if you see any shift in the future, or I'm just curious what your brilliant minds think of all of this. It keeps me up at night.
Sure.
Does anyone want to take that one?
We need a regularization scheme for young people who are here as refugee claimants, especially if they're claiming on the SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity, or members of a social class. I think the same thing for women who are claiming status based on domestic and/or state violence. I think it's a conversation we need to continue to have with our politicians, especially when they show up at our doors over the next few months, that we have a growing number of young claimants here in Canada, and we have also failed claimants of young people who are staying because they can't return home. Canada needs a regularization system. We came close in 2011. Unfortunately, the Paul Martin government was brought down, but I think it's a conversation we need to put back up. I think that the acceptance level for LGBTI folk is fairly high, so it makes no sense that we're not thinking of landing them as a class in and of themselves.
I will just add that the latest messaging from IRCC Canada, regarding services is that LGBTQ plus peoples are a population that they want to see more services of. That's for permanent residents.
That's right.
But more services for permanent residents will have a spillover effect, I think, for the community as well.
And I also think we need to send a message to service agencies that just because the federal government says that they won't fund your services for non-permanent residents does not mean you should not be providing services to non-permanent residents, right? It just means that you can't count it in the iCares or whatever that system is called. Service organizations have a responsibility to provide services to people who show up at your doors.
Okay, one more, okay.
Yeah, it's just a quick commentary to bring a little more kind of upbeat, optimistic perspective going forward. Early intervention for me as a vocational settlement practitioner means getting to individuals who are looking for certain skill-based positions early on when they arrive. And not unlike what Debbie mentioned about the importance of storytelling, I had an engineer, civil engineer from Trinidad, and he was looking for a position in Toronto. One of his first interview questions was, and this was when we were running specialized job search workshops for internationally trained professionals. His first question was, do you know the Ontario Buildings Code? Which he didn't. That's a fast, small manual to get through to up the game for him to be able to qualify to access those jobs. He is working as an engineer. That was a few years back. Now he comes back to us to offer up job positions for other newcomer engineers who are looking in the field. So for me, the hope going forward is early intervention so people don't wither, getting caught up in survival jobs that they don't need to access when their skills are in high demand all over. And also, some of my international clients also went out of province because Toronto is not the Mecca. So you go where you can go and work in your field. Like one of my internationally trained engineers who went to Boston for 1 week of training, back to Toronto, and then took a contract in Newfoundland, left his family in Toronto, came back telling me how wonderfully friendly Newfoundland people are, and then moved his whole family out to Newfoundland to keep that job.
Okay. Well, I think you have your elevator speech for when you're in the elevator with the Premier, all ready to go. I want to do 3 thanks. So I want to thank you all for coming and joining us today and being part of this. We do hope to have all the presentations and ultimately recording as well on the CERIS website. I want to thank our fantastic panelists for doing the work in preparation for the day today. And I want to thank all the volunteers who helped to make today possible. Su Yang, Wei Bin, John, Amina, Denise, Nawal, Rob, Alka, and of course our Knowledge Mobilization Officer, Rana El Kadi. Thank you so much. Where is she? There she is. Our panelists will be around for the next 5 minutes, and there's still refreshments, and please join us. Thank you.